Welcome back to Daz's Unite YouTube channel. Today we're going to kick off a sequence of tutorials centered around lighting. And to start out, I thought we would go over render settings and just the interface for that in general. There's a lot to know when it comes to lighting. It's one of the more difficult aspects of Daz Studio. And first off, let's figure out where render settings are. I'm currently using the City Limits Light workspace, and so that's why you see the way it looks now. And you can actually update your interface, the look of it, by going to Window, Workspace, Select Layout on a Mac, and I assume it's similar for a PC. And you would see that list of options here. As far as I know, most folks really like City Limits Light. It allows you to easily access most items. If you're brand new, you might try one of these more full service options that give you a lot more tips and make it a little bit easier to figure out what to do in what order. But once you get the hang of things, City Limits Light is a really good interface. The options that you find are over here. Usually I think to start out, render settings is over here on the left side sidebar. And if for some reason it isn't there, you can always right click here in this general sort of dark gray area and choose it from this list here. Of course, it's not here because I already have it selected. There are a lot of options in here, and eventually I'll go through a lot of these, but for now, we're just going to look at render settings. And it kind of separates the different areas into tabs to make it easier to find what you're looking for. And we're just going to pop through here, and I'll show you kind of how I set things up. And every artist who works with Daz is going to do this differently. You kind of just need to play around and push all the buttons and see what everything does and see what works best for you. So for example, let's kick things off with a discussion of the General tab. You can set your preset to a particular dimension. And just to go over a little bit what that means, what is in your little window here is what's actually going to be rendered. You can actually shut that off if you want. I'm trying to remember where that's at. I think it's show aspect frame, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So what that does, if you right click in this little, I think they call that a hamburger menu. It's the options menu, and you select that aspect frame. It will actually show you up in the corner, it'll say 6:9 or whatever your dimensions happen to be. And it will actually show you what that would look like in the final render. So if I go over here to the NVIDIA iRay view, it will show you more or less what your final render will potentially look like. And it's in this 6:9 ratio for this particular example. And just to give you an idea of what it would look like if we chose something different, let's say the golden ratio landscape, so it'll make it wider instead of taller. You can see it instantly changes, and it will show you right here what that ratio is at all times. So that's really nice to know. And I keep meaning to do this. The types of renders that I do are for selling to others. So what I tend to do is hold on, I'm going to do the golden ratio for a second here. Actually, you know what I think I do? I do 6:9. I'm trying to remember where that's at. I know it's here somewhere. Or at least it used to. Maybe I just manually do it. I think that's probably what I do. So I tend to do a 5000 by 7500 pixel size, and the higher your numbers there, the more likely you're going to get a high quality render. It will increase your render times, and of course it depends on different factors, different options that you choose within this render settings window. But in general, you'll want to go high, and you can always downsize. That's kind of a little trick that some artists use. They'll jack up the size of their renders, and then they'll downsize it, and that will help to, in some cases, get rid of noise especially on the skin of figures. So it's one trick to kind of, if you've got a render that has low light in the image, or you're having trouble getting a clear picture of the skin of a figure, that's one trick to use. In my case, I'm usually creating characters for book covers, so I'll do 6:9 just because it's a ratio that I'm very familiar with. Sometimes when I'm doing landscape type images and I need like a greater width than I would for, say, a single character with no background, I will do something like 16:9 aspect ratio. So keep that in mind, that what you choose, especially for this pixel size, if you're trying to make something that's 300 dpi, say for a print project, like a print book cover, for example, you would want to make sure that you have a pixel size that's big enough that you can, when you downsize it, that pixel size, and update the DPI to 300, that you won't ruin your quality. Because remember, anything you render out of Daz Studio is going to be in 72 DPI. And if you want a 300 DPI, which is the standard for print images, you will want to have a higher higher pixel size, and then you'll downsize it and update that 72 to 300. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a little confusing. It certainly was for me when I first started, because I hadn't realized that everything would automatically be in 72 DPI. Okay, so when you are rendering, you've got your render button up here, and once you've got all your settings the way you want them, that's where you would actually hit to render. One quick tip that I've learned is you can more quickly see a render pop into your render window by choosing the NVIDIA Iray view and then clicking render, and it will allow that image to pop into the main render window. This window here, it will show up faster than it would if you didn't have NVIDIA Iray running. What I'm not quite clear on myself is whether you should always have NVIDIA Iray view off when you're rendering. I would assume so, but I haven't gotten a clear, definitive, word on that, and I'll probably update the description of this video when I figure that out. But I always have it on texture shaded mode instead of NVIDIA Iray mode right before I hit the render button, just for reference. Okay, so this will make your image pop in faster if you have NVIDIA Iray running, and then this allows me to more quickly see how a render might look, so I can kind of look at it in really high, like through the window. So let's move on to render type. Well, I should say you can constrain your proportions if you are fiddling around with your aspect ratio, and if your proportions are on, here, let me turn this off. It will change the ratio it will keep the height the same if you change your width. So for example, if I put 12 here, it'll keep that at 9. Oh no, actually it's pixel size, pardon me. So if I change my pixel size, it will actually take that down to 6 based on the ratio I chose. So just keep that in mind. If you need it to be some wonky combination of height versus width, or so you would just turn that off and it will change. Like for example, if you want this to be 600, or excuse me, 6,000, that will remain the same because I've turned off that constrained proportions. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Oops. Oh, this got changed. There we go. All right, all back to normal. So the render type is really only important if you're always doing still images. If all you're rendering is a single image, you would always choose still image for your current frame. If you were actually creating an animation, you would either choose image series or movie. And since I haven't been doing too much with the animation side of things, I will leave that for some other fantastic artist to explain. But I will say this, I've heard that creating an image series is a little bit easier for an artist to control and manipulate rather than the movie option, so just keep that in mind. You can actually change the type of image that's created, but I almost always need a PNG because that means it will end up with a transparent background if I want it to, and I almost always want to. I'm usually creating just figures and I want them to have no background at all. So in this case, if you're looking at the NVIDIA iRay image, you can see that there's a shadow and he's standing on the ground. Normally what I do is I will turn off the ground and I will also turn off the dome, which means there's no background at all. And the PNG, you'll know it's a PNG if you just see this great gray background and there's nothing, there's no shadows, no nothing there. If your draw dome is on, whatever is in your environment map is what will be showing around that character. And of course, if you have the draw ground on, it will show a shadow or possibly no shadow, depending on how you've got your intensity and other settings set. So in this case, we're just going to have that off for now and pop back into general. So this is where you would actually, name the file that you're going to render. And then I will put it into, I have my own paths for where I put all of my renders. There is a default setting for where your renders go, and you can certainly leave them in Daz Studio's filing system if you prefer. I keep all my files for Daz Studio on an external hard drive because I'm starting to get quite the collection and it's kind of bogging my computer down. And so I have all of my renders also on that external hard drive. And I have them in some pretty extensive filing system based on genre of character and whether they have hair or not, or I separate them by pose and all sorts of things. So that's where you would change your image path depending on what you want or where you want to save it. The auto headlamp is a kind of artificial light. And that's what you're seeing, I think, here. The fact of the matter is, when there are no scene lights, no mesh lights, no spotlights or distant lights or any of that kind of thing, you still need to have a light to actually see what you're looking at, what you're creating in your render window here. So what this does for you is it creates an artificial light that isn't real, that doesn't look natural, but it allows you to see your scene so you can make changes and so on. You can turn it to never, so it's never on, and you can also have it set to when no scene lights are in the image, or in your window, you can have it turn the auto headlamp on, so at least you can see something. So let me show you what that means. So I'm just going to pop in, or actually, let me just create, I think, a spotlight. Okay, so I've turned the auto headlamp off and I've put in a spotlight. That's why nothing is showing. And let's see what happens when we click on NVIDIA iRay. Weirdly, I think that spotlight is right next to his feet, so you can see when you are rendering in the iRay mode here. And if I turn that off again, it would turn black because there's the auto headlamp is off. And then when I turn it on, you'll see the light again. So just keep that in mind, that it's set to default to when no scene lights are present. It will keep it on, but you can turn it off in a couple different places, and I've already forgotten all the places where you can turn it off. It seems like is one of them here. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. Seems like it's on, oh, that's on point. Okay. Regardless, that is one place where you can mess around with the auto headlamp. I've never messed with this, so I'm not touching it. Okay, so that's through the general tab, and then the render mode, I always use photoreal. But you can use interactive, and it works for some things. I'll leave that for another tutorial. But in this case, I'm always going to be using photoreal, so that's just how I have it set. Okay, so this is a tutorial all its own. You can set different parameters, and you can get wildly different results depending on what you've got going on. Actually, let me get back here to... I'm curious what happens if I got rid of spotlight. Would it turn the headlamp back on? Oh, yeah, it does. I never really thought about it. Okay, so here we have, I've done a couple of different things. I'm still doing a lot of lighting testing myself. But one thing I never mess with is the minimum update samples and the minimum samples. That seems to be something that people just leave at defaults. Nobody ever talks about making changes with those for whatever reason. I also don't mess with the update interval. I'm sure as I move along, I'll know more about that particular item and if it's necessary to make changes to it. The way I started out and the way I learned is to keep rendering quality enabled to on. And I will change the rendering quality from something like 2 to 5, somewhere in there. So lately I've been just setting it to a quality of 3. And it can make quite a difference if you've got your rendering quality setting on. The higher the number, the longer the render will be. And for my purposes, I really want to have really photorealistic skin on my characters. So I want them to look their absolute best, and I'll just give them as much time as they need to render well. One thing that these settings can kind of change depending on, like, if you choose something for one item like max time, it will make a difference for like rendering converged ratio. So there's a lot of back and forth with this, and there's a lot to know, and I don't know everything myself. But one thing I do know is that you should never go above what, 99% or 99.5% or so when it comes to this rendering converged ratio. It can never finish, so it will just go on forever. So most people will set it to 98 or 98. I think I always choose 98.5, but you can go up to like 99.1 or whatever. It's just you don't want it to go to 100%. And you want it to be really high because it will make a difference in the quality of your final render. Now, that said, I've also heard from others that you should, when you've got your rendering quality enabled, you should jack up your max samples to the max and jack up your max time to the max. And then you choose at that point when you want the render to stop. And that's why choosing the render window, instead of sending your file, your render direct to a specific file folder, you should always have the new window option selected, because that will actually open up that window and you can watch the render happen. So what I tend to do is I'll run a render overnight, and in the morning I'll check it and I'll see how it looks. And if I find that it just needs a little more time, I'll give it another hour or two. Or if I find that everything's resolved well and there's not a lot of noise on the neck especially, or on the skin in general, I will basically stop the render at that point, and that changing the max time and max samples to infinity, basically, it will allow me to make the choice of when I want that rendering to stop. Now, you can also do kind of almost the opposite. You can shut this off, and you can set your max time to 0, I believe. And you can set your max samples to whatever, a test run of, I think 5,000 is the max samples default, I should say. And you can set the max time to 0. And this is another method of rendering that I'm experimenting with currently. So really just give both sort of methods a try and see what works best for you. And every render is going to be different. What might work for a single figure with no background will be potentially quite different than, say, rendering an interior scene or rendering an outdoor scene. So a lot of times it really just boils down to playing around with the options and checking things out. Okay, so I haven't messed with this yet, so I'm not touching it. And that one I also never mess with. And here, the one thing I have played around with to some degree is the noise denoiser, which is kind of a new feature in the latest version of Daz Studio. And you have to turn both on. You basically make it available and then you enable it. And that's really all I change on those two things. I'll probably, as I move along, I'll probably just do a short tutorial on just this feature as I play around with it some more. And another thing you can play with, I should say about the denoiser, some people will say that it works well for getting rid of noise on the skin and the other objects. Others say they don't really like how the denoiser works. I've just been playing with it and I really don't have a strong enough opinion about it one way or the other. I really need to do some further testing, really, just to kind of play around with it and see before and after kind of thing, to be able to say, yes, it works great, or no, it doesn't. So another option in here that you should know about is the bloom filter. And when you enable it, there are some different options. And what it will do, it will actually sort of, bloom is a kind of glow. It can add a glow to, say, city lights or light on water, for example. You can add bloom to, say, lights of a spaceship. So it can be a bit finicky, and you really want to have a light hand when you're playing with the filters for it. It can really overwhelm an image with light. and kind of blur things out a bit. So I recommend just kind of playing around with it and seeing what happens. I don't really have anything that will bloom usefully for this particular guy in this jeans outfit here, but I'll probably do another tutorial on that once I've played with that option a bit more. Okay, this is another section I don't play with, but I do play with this one. Let's have a look and see what some of these settings do. Okay, I've played with exposure value, shutter speed, f-stop, and the film ISO, and I am still playing with this stuff quite a bit. Whoa, I forgot I turned on bloom. Apparently I made him bloom. As you can see, it kind of gives the weird hazy look to things. And I really haven't played too much with it. Let's just look and see what happens when we play with the settings. Oh, interesting. You can change the brightness scale. So I'm just going to turn it off for now and pop back down here into tone mapping. So a lot of these you may recognize from photography. These are certain, like especially I'm sure you've heard of f-stops. And these settings, you really have to have a light hand with them, because changing just one can drastically change the amount of light in your scene. As an example, let's just change it to 10, or how about 4? You can see the difference. It's quite noticeable. So I'm really careful about playing with these, unless I usually don't want to play with them. I usually like to use lighting sets, assets like Render Studio 2.0 or Boss, I think it's Boss Light System. And I like, or render settings within other assets, rather than actually playing around with them here. If I really need something to be more well lit than a particular lighting system gives me, I will actually start fiddling with these a little bit. Particularly when I am playing with HDRIs and using that for lighting a scene or a character, I will often play with these settings. So just to give you another idea, let's just change this. That changes it quite a bit. And then if we go the opposite direction, let's see how wildly different these are. So you kind of have to play. They all kind of work together to create a particular look. One thing I will note, vignetting is it won't really work that well with, say, a single character. It's more for whole scenes, and it will create a kind of, I actually haven't really played with this, but I'm assuming that if you take it up, it will change the vignette to a white, hazy area around the outside of your image. And then if you go to the left, I think it would probably be black, or it could be the opposite, I don't know. But anyway, usually vignetting is typically either white or black around the edges of an image, so keep that in mind. You can also change the white point scale, which I haven't needed to worry about. I do change the burn highlights and the crush blacks quite a bit. This will saturate sort of like the highlights and the dark shadowed areas of your image. So I tend to fiddle with these quite a bit. The defaults are, I guess those are the defaults. I never really pay attention. Yeah. 0.25 for burn highlights and 0.20 for crush blacks. So I tend to I'll start out with like a 0.44 on both of them, I think, and then kind of fiddle from there. And I recommend doing something similar just to see what you come up with. And I also do post work in Photoshop, and I'll increase my shadows and highlights with different options in there as well. And the other two things you can fiddle with are saturation and gamma, but I tend to prefer fiddling with those types of settings in Photoshop, where I have a bit more control. Here, it's a kind of destructive thing, where if you've changed the saturation, you can't change it again. Once you've rendered it out in a particular saturation, you can't go in and sort of fix it after the fact within the Daz Studio interface. It's easier to just keep it at a base amount of saturation and then take it into another Photoshop like program and make your changes there, where you can do it non-destructively, where you can make a change as a filter or adjustment layer. And that's a non-destructive way of doing it, because you can just get rid of it if you don't like it, or make a change easily without baking it into the image. Okay, so environment is the last tab. And this is a really important tab, particularly this right here, the environment mode. What I will do is I will often choose scene only, which means all you're going to see in here is whatever your scene lights are. So for example, if we have a spotlight in here, we may, see, you can see that I'm kind of lighting up as I move that camera back, or excuse me, that spotlight back. You can now see him lit up. And that's what that means, scene only. If you have a dome in scene, you'll actually light up the scene with also that, whatever that environment map is. So that's where you're seeing way more light on him now. That's coming from that overhead dome HDRI that's surrounding him. And if we turn on the dome, you can see basically what that light is. It's a kind of hazy, out of focus, daytime shot. And another option would be dome only, and I don't ever have a need to do just dome only. I can't even think of a reason why you would need that, but you never know. And then sun and sky is another one I've used, and I will do sun and sky sometimes when I want an outdoor scene. And sun and sky is fascinating because you can actually change the location of what that sun, you can actually sort of select a sun that was shining on a particular day in a particular longitude and latitude on Earth. I haven't played around with it too much, just to kind of see how it changes the look of something, as opposed to the HDRI option with the dome. So I have played with it. I know how to use it. I don't use it very often because it takes so much more time to kind of get the exact, sundial that I want. What I will tend to do is I'll select it and have a kind of late day time period. And you can even choose the year, which is crazy. And you can rotate that sun around by rotating the dome. So you can change where the light hits him. You can see that it's on the back of his neck there, and here it's like right on the other side of him, and no longer, like here he's getting a rim light, and here he's getting like more of a key light. And come to think of it, I should probably explain a little bit what those are. Key light is kind of a main light on a person. It's sort of like the largest light. It's more in their face or on their, like, or it's attached to the, like, shining kind of on their hip area or their head area. And it's their main light that's lighting them. A rim light is sort of behind the character, and it's lighting sort of the edges of their body, sort of giving them a nice outline. So if we were doing that, that is basically a rim light along the side of the back side of him. And another light you might have heard of is a fill light, and that can be sort of off to the side a bit, and it does what it says it does. It fills in, sort of evens out shadows and lights kind of from the other side. That there's like the key light is on one side, and then the fill light will kind of fill in a softer, more distant, or more less intense light on the other side of the face, kind of thing. So those are some different options, and there's soft boxes, there's Rembrandt lighting. There's a lot of options, and I'll probably go over that more in depth a little bit later. But you can change all sorts of things. I tend to just move the dome around. If I'm on sun and sky, or if I'm on dome and scene, I'll move that light around to kind of get a sense of how it might look and how I feel like, lighting the person. And again, you can always turn the dome on and off. And if you've got the dome off, you've basically turned off that HDRI, so it's no longer showing. The actual physical HDRI is not showing anymore, but the light can still be showing if you've got the draw dome off. So in this case, I've turned off the dome so you can't see the actual HDRI, but you can still see the light coming from it. So there's that. And then you can also blur the light. You can change the resolution of the light, the intensity. Let's jack up the intensity to like 5 or something. See how it's really bright. Let's see. And then you can also change it down to like make it lower. So there's so many settings to play with, and you really just kind of need to jump in and play. And every scene, every figure that you want to light is going to need some different parameters. You can always start with a base setting for all of these things and then kind of work from there. But this gives you a nice overview, and hopefully you learned a few things about what you can use and how you can use it. But definitely feel free to ask questions down below, and feel free to subscribe to this video series. We'll be continuing on as we go. And thanks for listening.